The night our baby was due didn't just feel like the culmination of months of preparation, it felt like the climax of our entire lives together. I'd spent countless nights imagining it, holding my wife's hand, seeing her through every contraction, and witnessing the miraculous moment we became parents. I thought I was ready. Bags packed? Check. Birth plan printed and memorized? Check. Emotional stamina? Double check. But nothing could have prepared me for how quickly things spiraled out of control. It started like one of those stormy nights in a thriller movie. My wife woke me up at 2:37 a.m., clutching her belly and whispering, "I think it's time." My heart did that weird leap it always does in life's most surreal moments, and then I sprang into action. Car keys, hospital bag, phone charger, check, check, and check. As I backed the car out of the driveway, I kept glancing at her in the passenger seat, her face pale, her breathing deliberate. Every few minutes I asked, "Are you okay?" She'd nod, but I could see her gripping the armrest, her knuckles turning white. The roads were deserted, except for the occasional set of headlights cutting through the darkness. Rain started falling, not heavy, just enough to make everything feel a little more cinematic. I was torn between wanting to drive like Vin Diesel and knowing the baby didn't need us arriving at the ER in a mangled car. My wife squeezed my hand at one point and said, "Don't worry, we'll make it." Her voice was calm, but I knew her well enough to sense the edges of fear. When we pulled into the hospital, I half expected a Hollywood-style greeting with doctors and nurses rushing out with a wheelchair. Instead, it was just us, walking through those sliding glass doors into the fluorescent-lit quiet of the maternity wing. A young nurse greeted us, her ponytail swinging as she glanced at my wife's chart. She smiled reassuringly and said, "All right, let's get you settled." We were ushered into a room that was sterile but oddly cozy, soft lighting, pastel walls, a faint smell of antiseptic mixed with lavender. My wife changed into a hospital gown, and I busied myself setting up her water bottle, her favorite playlist, and her snack stash, trying to mask how nervous I was. I kissed her forehead, whispering, "You're incredible. We've got this." Enter Lisa, the midwife. Lisa strode in like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, exuding the kind of confidence that was equal parts reassuring and intimidating. She was tall, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her no-nonsense tone made it clear she wasn't there to coddle anyone. "All right," she said briskly. "Let's get to work. How far apart are the contractions?" As my wife answered, I stayed by her side, squeezing her hand. Lisa barely acknowledged me, which I brushed off at first. She was focused on my wife, after all. But something about her energy felt off. She gave orders like a drill sergeant, barking instructions to the nurses and occasionally glancing at me as if I were an unruly kid tagging along on a field trip. I tried to ignore it. This wasn't about me. It was about my wife and our baby. Still, a tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered that this woman was going to be a problem. I didn't know how right I was. For now, though, I was still in the room, holding my wife's hand, oblivious to the storm brewing. Little did I know, the next time I walked through those doors, everything would be different, and I'd never get back the moment stolen from me. Part 2: The Conflict. It wasn't immediate, Lisa's decision to banish me from the room. At first, she just ignored me, treating me like an afterthought. She'd breeze past my questions with curt, distracted answers, her focus entirely on my wife. Which, fine, I get it, she's the patient. But every time I tried to offer comfort, rub my wife's back, or even just hold her hand through a contraction, Lisa would find a reason to step between us. It was subtle, at first, the way she'd place herself physically in my way. But as the labor intensified, so did her efforts. At one point, my wife let out a pained moan that ripped through me. I instinctively leaned closer, whispering, "You're doing amazing. I'm right here." Lisa cut me off with a sharp look. "Can you give her some space?" she said flatly, not even bothering to make it sound like a suggestion. I blinked, stunned. My wife squeezed my hand, her grip weak but her eyes pleading. "It's okay," she whispered, though I could tell she didn't mean it. She was exhausted, and I didn't want to add to her stress, so I reluctantly took a small step back. Lisa didn't even thank me. She just went back to her clipboard as if I were furniture she'd moved out of the way. I should have spoken up then, but I told myself not to make waves. This was about my wife and the baby, not my ego. Still, the air in the room felt charged, like a storm cloud was forming, and I was the only one who could feel it. Then it happened. Lisa turned to me mid-contraction and said, "I think it's best if you step out." The words hit me like a slap. "What?" I asked, sure I'd misheard. "It's getting intense," she said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes fathers get overwhelmed, and it's not helpful for the mother. We need her to focus." I stared at her, my mind racing. "I'm not overwhelmed. I'm here to support my wife." Lisa's expression didn't waver. "This isn't about you. It's about creating the right environment for her. Trust me, I've done this hundreds of times. She'll be better off without distractions." Distractions? That's what she thought I was. A distraction? My wife whimpered softly, another contraction stealing her breath, and I felt torn in two. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and I didn't want to fight in front of her. But leaving? That felt unthinkable. "No," I said firmly, planting my feet. "She wants me here." Lisa's eyes narrowed. "Sir, I'm the medical professional here. I know what's best." I opened my mouth to argue, but my wife's hand on my arm stopped me. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice so faint I could barely hear it. Her eyes glistened with tears, not from the pain of labor, but from the strain of being caught in the middle. She just wanted peace, and I felt like the world's worst husband for not giving it to her. Lisa seized the moment. "There's a waiting room down the hall," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. Before I could respond, a nurse appeared at her side, gently ushering me toward the door. "Wait," I said, my voice rising. "This is my child. I have a right to be here." Lisa didn't even look at me. "We'll call you when it's time." The nurse tugged at my arm, and my wife let out another pained moan. I hesitated, caught between standing my ground and not wanting to make things worse for her. Finally, I let myself be led out, the door closing behind me with a soft click that felt like a punch to the gut. In the hallway, I stood frozen, my fists clenched at my sides. My brain replayed the scene over and over, each time making me angrier. How could Lisa decide I didn't belong in the room? Who gave her the right to rob me of this moment? As I made my way to the waiting room, my thoughts spiraled. What if something went wrong? What if my wife needed me, and I wasn't there? The idea of missing our baby's first moments, their first cry, their tiny fingers curling for the first time, was unbearable. I sat down heavily in a hard plastic chair, my leg bouncing uncontrollably. I couldn't let this happen. I had to do something. But then another thought struck me, one that made my stomach churn. What if Lisa convinced my wife that I shouldn't be there? What if, in her vulnerable state, my wife came to believe that I was a distraction? I shook my head, trying to push the thought away, but it lingered, gnawing at me. I needed to get back in that room. But how? Part 3: The Waiting Room. The waiting room was a nightmare of stillness. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the stiff plastic chairs offered no comfort. I sat there, staring at the clock, every second dragging longer than the last. My wife was in the delivery room, going through the most important moment of our lives, and I was stuck out here, powerless. I tried to focus on anything but the gnawing anxiety clawing at my chest. My phone was useless. My hands were shaking too much to scroll. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured my wife, alone and scared, reaching for me while Lisa kept me locked out. At one point, a young dad walked in, beaming. "It's a boy," he announced to no one in particular, showing off pictures on his phone. Everyone clapped and congratulated him, but I couldn't join in. My stomach twisted into knots. I should have been him. I should have been the one celebrating, holding my wife's hand, and meeting our baby together. Then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched cry echoing down the hall. My heart leapt. Was that our baby? I jumped to my feet, staring at the doors, desperate to run through them, but my feet wouldn't move. What if something was wrong? The thought froze me in place. Finally, a nurse appeared and called my name. "Your wife and baby are fine," she said with a reassuring smile. Relief hit me like a wave, and I followed her down the hallway. But as I stepped into the room and saw my wife cradling our baby, tears streaming down her cheeks. The weight of what I'd missed crushed me. I had missed it, the first cry, the first moments of my daughter's life. And no matter what anyone said, I'd never get that back. Part 4. The missed moment. When I stepped into the room, everything around me blurred. All I could focus on was my wife, lying back against the hospital bed, her face pale and tear-streaked, cradling a tiny bundle swaddled in soft pink. For a moment, the world fell away. This was it, our baby, our miracle. But instead of the joy I'd expected to feel, there was a hollow ache in my chest. "You have a beautiful daughter," my wife whispered, her voice trembling. She looked exhausted, her smile forced as if she was trying to hold back her own grief. I moved closer, my legs feeling like they might give out beneath me, and gently touched the baby's tiny hand. Her fingers curled around mine instinctively, and my heart cracked wide open. She was perfect. Her little nose, her soft tufts of hair, the way her eyes fluttered shut, it was all so surreal. This was our child, the person we'd been dreaming about for 9 long months. But as I stared at her, another realization clawed its way into my mind: I hadn't been there. "Is she okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My wife nodded, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. "She's perfect," she said, her tone bittersweet. I could see it in her eyes, she felt it too. The absence. The moment that should have belonged to the 3 of us stolen. I turned to the nurse, desperate for answers. "Why wasn't I called sooner? Why wasn't I allowed back in?" The nurse looked uncomfortable, glancing at the floor. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "The midwife, she thought it would be best for your wife's focus." Focus. That word burned like acid. Lisa had decided, without our consent, that my role as a husband and father didn't matter. My wife had faced the pain and fear of childbirth alone, while I sat uselessly in a cold waiting room. As the weight of it all crashed over me, I turned back to my wife. She looked at me, guilt pooling in her eyes. "I wanted you there," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I told her I needed you, but she wouldn't let you in. I'm so sorry." My stomach twisted in rage and heartbreak. "It's not your fault," I said quickly, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking her hand in mine. "She had no right to do that. None of this is on you." I held her close, careful not to disturb the baby. But the ache wouldn't leave. I couldn't stop imagining what I'd missed. The moment our daughter took her first breath, her first cries filling the room, my wife seeing her for the first time. I dreamed about that moment for months, only for it to be ripped away. I stayed by their side for as long as I could, watching my daughter sleep and trying to memorize every tiny detail of her. But anger simmered beneath my joy. Lisa had stolen something from me that I would never get back, a memory that should have been etched into my soul forever. Before I left the room, I kissed my wife's forehead and whispered, "I'll be back soon." She nodded, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and I slipped out into the hallway. I wasn't sure where Lisa was, but I knew one thing: I couldn't let this go. This wasn't just about me, it was about my family and the moments we should have shared. Moments that were taken from us by someone who had no right. And I wasn't going to stop until I got answers. Part 5. The Confrontation. I left the room with my fists clenched and my heart racing, the soft hum of hospital monitors fading behind me. The air in the hallway felt suffocating, and I could hear the blood pounding in my ears as I marched toward the nurse's station. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but I knew one thing for sure: Lisa was going to hear me. When I reached the station, there she was, calm, composed, and utterly unaware of the emotional wreckage she'd left in her wake. She was flipping through a chart, her pen gliding smoothly across the page as if she hadn't just robbed me of one of the most important moments of my life. I stopped in front of her, my shadow casting across her workspace. She looked up, her expression indifferent. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with false politeness. "You can explain to me why you forced me out of the delivery room," I said, my voice low but trembling with anger. "Why you decided that I didn't deserve to witness the birth of my daughter." Lisa sighed, setting down the chart as if she were about to deal with a petulant child. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but I made the decision that was best for your wife. She needed a calm, focused environment." "No," I cut her off, stepping closer. You don't get to decide what's best for my wife and my family. That was our moment, and you took it away. She wanted me there. She told me that. You ignored her, and you ignored me." Her expression tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Sometimes, fathers can become distractions in high-stress situations. It's my job to ensure the delivery is as safe as possible." I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. A distraction? I was her support. I was supposed to be there, holding her hand, telling her she was doing great, helping her feel less alone. Instead, you made her go through it by herself. Do you even understand what you've done? Her composure faltered, just slightly. Your wife delivered a healthy baby, and that's what matters. No, I snapped, my voice rising. What matters is that you disrespected us. You took away a moment we'll never get back. I wasn't there for my daughter's first breath. I wasn't there to comfort my wife when she needed me most. You had no right. The nurses behind the station began to shift uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Lisa and me. A younger nurse stepped forward, looking hesitant. Sir, she said softly, I understand this is emotional, but maybe we can discuss this with the administration. I nodded, my voice calmer but no less firm. Oh, we will. You can count on that. Lisa straightened her posture, her professional mask sliding back into place. If you feel the need to file a complaint, you're welcome to. I was acting in the best interest of the patient. The patient wanted me there. I shot back. You ignored her voice and made a decision based on your own assumptions. I'll be filing more than a complaint. She didn't respond, just stared at me with the same detached expression. It made my blood boil. But I knew I wasn't going to get the apology or the accountability I wanted, not here, not from her. I turned and walked away, my chest heaving with every breath. As I headed toward the administration office, I thought about my wife, alone in that room, and my daughter, taking her first breath without me there. Lisa's words echoed in my mind, but they didn't make me feel any better. A healthy baby is what matters. Of course my daughter's health mattered. Of course my wife's safety mattered. But that didn't mean the emotional impact didn't matter, too. That moment was ours, and Lisa had no right to take it from us. When I reached the office, I asked to speak to someone in charge. The receptionist looked at me, surprised by my intensity, but she quickly arranged for me to meet with a patient relations manager. As I waited, I rehearsed everything I wanted to say, every detail I needed to include. I wouldn't let this go. I owed it to my wife, to my daughter, and to myself to make sure this didn't happen to another family. When the manager finally called me into her office, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe someone would finally listen. Maybe, just maybe, I could make this right, not by getting back what I'd lost, but by making sure it didn't happen to anyone else. Part 6, The Aftermath. After filing my complaint, I returned to the room where my wife and daughter waited. The sight of them should have brought nothing but joy, but instead, it felt bittersweet. My wife lay there, holding our baby, exhaustion etched into her face. She smiled weakly when she saw me, but there was a sadness in her eyes I couldn't ignore. How did it go? She asked softly as I sat beside her. I filed the complaint, I said, reaching for her hand. They're going to investigate. Lisa had no right to make that decision. My wife nodded but didn't say much. The air between us was heavy, filled with the things we both wanted to say but couldn't. I leaned down to kiss our daughter's tiny forehead, feeling her soft skin against my lips. She stirred slightly, her little fingers curling against the swaddle. It was a perfect moment, except it wasn't, because it wasn't whole. I'd miss her first breath, her first cry. I'd miss the moment she became a part of this world. Over the next few days, the hospital reached out to us for follow-up interviews. It turned out we weren't the only ones. Other complaints about Lisa had surfaced, families with eerily similar stories of being excluded or dismissed during critical moments. The hospital assured us they were taking our experiences seriously, but it felt hollow. No apology, no policy change, could give me back what I'd lost. The nights were the hardest. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, hearing phantom cries that weren't there, and wonder if it was guilt or grief. My wife struggled too. She'd talk about the delivery in pieces, her voice wavering as she admitted how alone she'd felt when Lisa forced me out. It broke me to hear it. We should have faced that moment together, not as strangers divided by a closed door. One evening, a few weeks later, I found myself holding my daughter while she slept. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of her breathing. I studied her tiny face, her delicate features, and tried to imagine what she'd looked like the moment she was born. It was a blank in my memory, a gap that would never be filled. I wondered if it would haunt me forever. When my wife came to join me, she sat down beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "You're here now," she said softly, as if she could read my thoughts. "That's what matters." Her words were comforting, but they didn't erase the ache. "I just keep thinking about what could have been," I admitted. "How different it would have felt if I'd been there." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I do too. But what we have now, this is ours. And no one can take it away." The hospital eventually sent a formal apology letter, promising to review their policies and address Lisa's actions. It was a small victory, one that brought a measure of closure but not the kind I wanted. Still, knowing that our story might prevent another family from going through the same heartbreak gave me some solace. Life moved on, as it always does. Sleepless nights with the newborn, first smiles, first laughs, they began to fill the void left by the moment I'd missed. And as I watched my daughter grow, I realized something. While I hadn't been there for her first cry, I was here for everything else. Her first steps, her first words, her first everything. And I wasn't going to let anything, not a missed moment, not a careless midwife, take those away from me. Even now, years later, that night still lingers in my memory like a scar. It reminds me of how fragile and fleeting those first moments are, and how easily they can be stolen. But it also reminds me to fight for the things that matter, to speak up when someone crosses a line, and to never let anyone tell me I don't belong in the most important moments of my family's life. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: the fight isn't just for the moment, it's for the memories you'll carry with you forever. And I'll be damned if I let anyone steal another one from me.